There is a room at Versailles that required a kidnapping to build. Not a kidnapping as a metaphor, a literal extraction of men from their country under false pretenses, followed by their deaths in a foreign city, followed by official silence about both. The room is the Hall of Mirrors, 357 glass panels running 73 meters along the west facade, completed in 1684, still standing, still visited by millions of people every year who walk through it, taking photographs, and never ask the question the room is actually asking. Louis XIV wanted this room for 2 decades before he could have it. Not because of the gold, not because of the painted ceilings, because of the mirrors. And the mirrors existed in only one place on Earth, made by only a handful of men who were forbidden from leaving the island where they lived and worked, on penalty of death, or the death of their families. That island is called Murano, and the official reason they give for why those men could never leave doesn't survive even basic scrutiny. The word ban gets attached to this story only when historians are forced to acknowledge what actually happened. The Venetian Republic did not ban mirrors. They controlled who could see their own face in one. For nearly 300 years, the technology to produce a flat, clear glass mirror, the kind you have above your bathroom sink, the kind you check yourself in before leaving the house, existed in exactly one location in the Western world. Venice held it. Venice enforced it with capital punishment. And when other governments finally broke that monopoly, the men who enabled the escape started dying in ways that the historical record carefully declines to explain. The world before the Venetian glass mirror is almost impossible to reconstruct emotionally. We know what a face looks like. We have always known what our faces look like, but for most of human history, that knowledge was not available to most people. The only reflective surfaces ordinary people encountered were water, still water in a bucket or a pond, dark and rippling, reversing left and right and distorting everything, and polished metal, polished bronze, polished silver for those who could afford it, polished steel, which returned a dim brownish shadow of a face rather than a face. These reflections were dark, small, curved, and inaccurate. They showed you something like your face, not your face. What this meant practically, for most of the medieval period, most people in Europe had never seen themselves. Not clearly, not the way another person saw them. Your own appearance was mediated entirely through other people's descriptions of you, through the faces of your relatives which carried your features imperfectly translated, through the rare and expensive commissioned portrait which a painter adjusted for flattery and convention. You had no private, unmediated, accurate knowledge of your own face. None. The Church, aware of this gap between the self and its visible image, developed an entire theology around it. The Latin word for mirror was speculum. The concept appeared in religious writing as both metaphor and warning. A mirror showed you what was on the surface. A pure soul was a mirror that reflected God. Vanity was what happened when you mistook the surface for the whole, and embedded in all of that theology was a single practical reality. Almost no one had a mirror anyway. The warning was largely theoretical. The Church did not need to suppress the technology. The technology barely existed outside a single island in the Venetian lagoon. Then Venice figured out how to make one that worked. The process was not discovered overnight. Murano glassmakers had been producing decorative glass for the Republic since at least the 13th century. They had been formally moved to the island in 1291, nominally to protect Venice from fire. The furnaces were a genuine hazard in a wooden city built on water. But the isolation that began as fire safety became something else entirely within a generation. By the 14th century, the island was a controlled zone. Glassmakers were given privileges, the right to marry into noble families, exemption from certain legal proceedings, in exchange for something the Republic valued more than their comfort, their permanent residence. Their knowledge stayed on Murano because they stayed on Murano. The Council of Ten, Venice's executive enforcement body, issued edicts throughout the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries, making the logic explicit. Glassmakers who shared their methods with foreign powers, or who emigrated to work for competing states, faced consequences that the edicts described in straightforward language. Their relatives remaining in Venice would be imprisoned. Agents of the Republic would be dispatched after them. These edicts are preserved in the Venetian state archives. They are not secret. They are quoted in academic histories of the glass trade with the same matter-of-fact tone used to describe any administrative policy, as if threatening to imprison a man's children for the crime of changing his city of residence were a routine regulatory measure. The mercury tin process was the specific secret, a thin sheet of tin foil coated with liquid mercury, pressed against freshly poured glass, produced an amalgam that bonded to the surface. When the glass was lifted from the foil, it carried a reflective backing of unprecedented clarity. The image it returned was accurate, flat, true, nothing like the dim shadow of polished bronze. You could stand before it and see exactly what you looked like. You could study your own face the way another person studied it. You could notice the asymmetry of your own features, the color of your eyes from the outside, the way your expression shifted when you thought no one was watching. This experience, this specific private encounter with your own true image, had never been generally available to human beings before, and for 3 centuries, Venice maintained almost exclusive control over who could have it. By the 17th century, the economics of Venetian mirrors had reached a scale that requires a moment of pause to absorb. A single large mirror from Murano, shipped to Paris or London or Madrid, cost approximately as much as a painting by a recognized Dutch master. Cardinal Mazarin's estate inventory, compiled after his death in 1661, listed his mirrors separately from his art collection, separate because their value was comparable. Historians who have studied the household inventories of great European families from this period consistently find mirrors itemized alongside major artworks rather than with furniture or household goods. They were not luxury objects in the modern sense, things that cost more than practical versions of themselves. They were unique commodities. There was no competition. Venice made them. Everyone else bought them or did without. Louis XIV understood this with the instinct of a man who knew exactly what power looked like physically. He wanted mirrors the way he wanted Versailles itself, not for the comfort but for the statement. In 1665, his finance minister Jean-Baptiste Colbert began a project that the official diplomatic record characterizes as the establishment of a French glassmaking industry. What the private correspondence reveals is something more operational. Colbert sent agents to Venice. Those agents identified specific master glassmakers on Murano. They made offers, significant payments, promises of French citizenship, housing, royal patronage. They were careful. Venice was watching, but the offers were apparently sufficient. Between 1665 and 1668, a group of Venetian mirror makers arrived in Paris. Their names appear in French royal records as skilled workers contracted to establish what would become the Manufacture Royale des Glaces de Miroir. They brought the mercury tin process with them. They began training French workers in the technique. Within a year, some of them were dead. The historical accounts are careful in their language. Contemporary sources describe illness, sudden illness that in the 17th century could have been almost anything: fever, bad water, ordinary misfortune. The Venetian state archives contain correspondence from this period that historians of the glass trade have cited without fully resolving. The Republic had agents in Paris. The Republic was aware of where the men were and what they were doing. Whether those agents carried anything more than diplomatic pressure is something the surviving documents decline to specify. What is verifiable is the pattern. Venetian workers came to France. Some died. Others, apparently frightened, returned to Venice despite the promises of royal patronage. The knowledge transfer was incomplete. France eventually had to develop its own alternative process, which Bernard Perrault accomplished in 1688 by inventing a method for casting flat glass, a genuinely different technique that did not depend entirely on what the Venetian workers had brought. The manufacture survived, but not all the men who made it possible survived with it. I spent 3 weeks with this part of the research before I could write a single word of this script. Not because the facts were difficult to find. Every detail I have described is documented in mainstream scholarship on early modern Venice and the French luxury trade. What kept me returning to the same sources, rereading the same dispatches, was a single question that the standard economic explanation never adequately answers, and it is not a subtle question. It is obvious the moment you ask it. A trade secret protects a manufacturing process. The standard response to a manufacturing secret being stolen is to protest diplomatically, to improve your own product, to find new applications for your advantage while you still hold it. You do not typically send agents to kill the men who took the knowledge to another country, because killing them does not unteach what they already taught. By the time any of those Venetian mirror makers died in Paris, French workers had already been trained. The knowledge was already out. Eliminating the source after the transfer served no economic purpose whatsoever. It served a different purpose entirely. It sent a message to every glassmaker still on Murano who was watching what happened to the men who left. This is where historians who study early modern Venice draw a distinction that the simple protectionism narrative consistently misses. Scholars like Richard McKenny, who has written extensively on the political culture of the Venetian Republic, make clear that the Council of Ten's enforcement of glassmaker confinement was never purely about the economics of mirrors. It was about the demonstration of reach, that the Republic could locate its subjects anywhere, that leaving was not an option the state would permit, that the island was not a gift, not the noble marriages, not the legal exemptions, but a cage that happened to be gilded. The privileges were the lock, not the key. And here is the part of the story that the economics explanation leaves entirely untouched. What happened to the people outside Venice who finally got access to an accurate mirror? What changed when the reflection became true? Historians of Renaissance selfhood, and this is a genuine scholarly subfield, anchored by work like Stephen Greenblatt's Renaissance Self-Fashioning, published in 1980, which traced the emergence of individual identity across the same period, have documented a cultural transformation that coincides precisely with the spread of quality mirrors across Northern Europe in the late 16th and 17th centuries. Self-portraiture as a sustained artistic genre explodes in this window. Dürer, Rembrandt, Velázquez, the great tradition of artists painting themselves with unprecedented psychological honesty, maps onto the period when accurate mirrors became accessible to professional painters. Before that availability, even a trained artist working from a polished metal surface was working from a distorted, darkened approximation. The explosion of interior psychology in literature during the same decades, the relentless self-examination of Montaigne, the inwardness of Shakespeare's late tragedies, the emergence of autobiography as a form, has been connected by scholars of early modern culture to the same shift in self-perception that the accurate mirror enabled. I want to be careful here. Correlation is not causation. The Renaissance had many causes. Individual selfhood emerged from many forces. I am not arguing that Venice held back psychological modernity with a tinfoil and mercury process. I am pointing at a connection between control over self-perception and control over a population that deserves more attention than it has received. When the Church described mirrors as instruments of vanity, it was not making an aesthetic judgment. It was describing a threat to the mediated relationship between a person and their own image, a relationship the Church had historically managed through theology and portrait conventions. When Venice imprisoned the men who could produce accurate self-reflection and hunted those who tried to share that ability with the outside world, it was not only protecting a manufacturing profit, it was enforcing a scarcity that had never been identified as scarcity before, because no one had yet named what was being withheld. What you see in a mirror has always been controlled by someone, until the moment it wasn't. Once you see that, it becomes difficult to unsee. The mercury tin process poisoned the men who used it. This detail appears in the technical literature on Venetian glassmaking without much commentary, as if it was simply an occupational hazard of the trade rather than a feature of the system. Mercury vapor is acutely toxic. Sustained exposure causes neurological damage, tremors, cognitive deterioration, eventual organ failure. The men on Murano who perfected the mirror backing process worked with liquid mercury daily, in enclosed furnace rooms, with no understanding of what it was doing to their nervous systems and no ability to refuse. They were not free to change their profession. They were not free to leave. They made the best mirrors in the world, and they died from making them. Confined to an island by a government that gave their daughters the right to marry nobles in partial compensation. The Council of Ten's edicts threatened their families if they left. The mercury threatened their bodies if they stayed. There was no version of this arrangement that was designed with their welfare in mind. The pattern that emerges when you hold all of this together, the confinement, the poisoning, the hunted workers in Paris, the deaths that the diplomatic record declines to name directly, is not the pattern of a state protecting a trade secret. It is the pattern of a state protecting a monopoly over a specific kind of knowledge at any cost, because that knowledge was understood to be more powerful than its economic value suggested. The Venetian Republic was not an unusually cruel government for its era. It was a sophisticated, literate, commercially brilliant oligarchy that had survived for centuries by correctly identifying what it needed to control, and for 300 years what it needed to control was the means by which human beings could accurately see themselves. The Hall of Mirrors at Versailles was completed in 1684, 357 panels, 17 arched windows facing the gardens, 17 mirror arches facing them, doubling and redoubling the light until the room seemed to contain more space than the architecture could explain. Foreign ambassadors brought to receive Louis XIV walked down that gallery and saw something that did not exist anywhere else on earth in that quantity, the unobstructed ability to see yourself perfectly, surrounded by the most visible expression of power in Europe, while the most powerful man in that Europe watched your reaction. The room was a psychological instrument. Every historian who writes about it acknowledges this. What they say less often is that it required the probable deaths of men who tried to bring the technology to an audience beyond one island in a lagoon. The Venetian restriction on mirrors was not a ban in the legislative sense. There is no single decree you can cite that forbids ordinary people from owning clear glass. What existed was something more durable than a law. It was the enforcement of a monopoly through the permanent confinement and occasional elimination of everyone who held the relevant knowledge. You can overturn a law. You cannot learn a secret from a dead man. Murano is a tourist destination now. You can visit the glass-blowing studios. You can buy ornamental glass animals and pendant lights and decorative bowls. The furnaces still burn. The island still makes glass. It is beautiful. And somewhere in the state archives of Venice, the edicts are still filed in sequence, the ones threatening glassmakers' families, the ones authorizing agents to pursue emigrant workers, the ones that enforced for 3 centuries the most precise control ever maintained over a human being's ability to see their own face. The documents are available to researchers. They have been cited in academic publications. They are not hidden. They just sit in an archive, describing a system that required extraordinary violence to maintain a monopoly over something the official history still describes as simply the glassmaking trade. Stand in front of any mirror, the one in your bathroom, the one in a hallway you pass without thinking. Consider what you are doing when you look into it. You are accessing information about your own face that for most of human history was unavailable to most people. Distorted, dark, mediated by other people's descriptions and a painter's flattering adjustments. The technology that made accurate self-knowledge available was worth killing for. The men who held it were killed for it, and the stated explanation that this was simply protecting a trade secret, a normal economic calculation no different from any other, does not survive the simple question of why eliminating the source of knowledge that had already escaped served any economic purpose at all. The Hall of Mirrors reflects you perfectly. It always has. The question is who decided for 300 years that you didn't deserve one?